Walter Stevens, who is the Charles Singleton Professor of Italian Literature at Johns Hopkins University. Are you having trouble hearing me?
Yes.
I see.
There's a whirring sound. It's probably drowning you out.
Walter Stevens, Johns Hopkins University, and who is who has been there, I guess, maybe about 10 years?
13,
or so?
13, yeah. 13.
And we are close friends. He has written an enormous amount on, I think the real way you're supposed to talk about it is early modern.
Yes.
Right? Early modern.
The
In the olden days, we used to call it Renaissance, but anyway. Early modern period from, it seems to me that the two names that keep popping up in his bibliography are Pico della Mirandola and Tasso, and he'll be speaking about Tasso tonight. And the very interesting thing about his work is the extent to which he deals with arcana, you know, folkloric and magical and wonders, and I think tonight we'll get an example of what he's done. And, so his title is on the board. Professor Stevens.
Oh, all right. Let me get my glass of water here. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and particularly with John. When I was a sophomore at Yale, I had a friend who came over to my room one night and said, we need to take Italian. There's this guy coming to Yale named Fracero, and we need to be able to do Dante when he gets here. And so that's how it started. Many more years ago than either John or I would like to remember. So, okay. Well, my title is Wonder of Wonders, Tasso, the History of Writing, and the Rome of Sixtus IV. I'm not going to be talking all that much about Sixtus IV, a fair amount about Tasso. Does everybody understand Italian pretty well?
No.
Okay, all right. I may have to do some translation on the fly, because I've got a number of quotations in Italian, but I'll do my best to keep it clean. Now, can everybody hear me back there?
Yes.
Do I need to speak like this, or can I speak like this?
Okay.
Second one's okay? All right, good. All right, so 1594 was a momentous year for Torquato Tasso. He completed and published the Discorsi sul poema eroico, vastly expanding the Discorsi dell'arte poetica of his youth in order to accompany and justify the Gerusalemme Conquistata, published the previous year in 1593. Tasso also completed and published Il Conte, ovvero delle Imprese, the last of his 25 dialogues, in the same month, November 1594, when he finished composing the Sette Giorni del Mondo Creato. Though it would not be printed until 12 years after his death, in 1607, Il Mondo Creato had significant consonances with the Conquistata and the dialogue. Perhaps even more than usual, Tasso was engaged in this period with questions about his writing. He had expanded his epic's bulk by about 40% through revisions and additions, and the Discorsi had undergone a comparable expansion. However, there were more general questions about writing, particularly regarding its nature and evolution that attracted Tasso's attention in 1594, both in the Conte, the dialogue, and in the Mondo Creato. More than at any time since the late 1570s, the poet of Gerusalemme Liberata was seeking a unified vision of his own work. However, this time, his questions were not limited to problems of genre, rhetoric, poetics, or religious orthodoxy. In the year or so before his death in 1595, Tasso dedicated considerable thought to the history of writing as an art. Rome in the late 1580s and early 1590s was a propitious environment for considering questions about the history of writing. European scholarship on all aspects of the subject had been growing rapidly throughout the 16th century. Already in 1499, Polydore Virgil had given pride of place to the art of writing in his encyclopedia, the De Inventoribus Rerum, or On the Discoverers of Things. Polydore claimed that only the deity, the elements, and the institution of marriage were more important than writing. I like that. In his few pages, Polydore collected 2 millennia of scattered lore about the history of writing. Tasso would not live to see the first self-standing attempt at a systematic history of writing, which was not published until 1617, and which I'll examine later in this talk. And of course, a truly scientific history of writing would not become possible until the 19th century. In the crucial 50 years between 1822, when Champollion announced his first successes in deciphering the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and 1872, when George Smith unveiled the flood tablet of Gilgamesh. Still, already in the final decade of Tasso's life, the history of writing was being transformed from a desultory scattering of mythical anecdotes into a unified story, which, if still unscientific, was of capital importance as a history of emotional attitudes toward writing. The most important advances in this emotional history were being made in Rome during the pontificate of Sixtus V. This pope's contributions to what I will call the prehistory of the history of writing were twofold: the transformation of the city's built environment and the impressive publications that he commissioned to celebrate this achievement. 3 of Sixtus' enterprises were of signal importance to publicizing ideas about the history of writing, while also celebrating the grandeur and magnanimity of the Pope himself as a patron and protector of the art. First, and of most enduring importance, was his expansion, renovation, and improvement of the Vatican Library, which turned it into one of the premier libraries of early modern Europe. Within the precincts of the library, a large number of grandiose frescoes created a second and even more eloquent means of bringing the history of writing to prominence by means of intense visualization. The third element in the Pope's program of celebration through monuments was the one that is most familiar from Tasso's dialogue, Il Conte. That is, the excavation, restoration, and re-erection of 4 ancient Egyptian obelisks. These had been brought to Rome during its imperial age, but had fallen or been cast down during the Middle Ages. Acting on commission from the Pope in 1586, the architect and engineer Domenico Fontana placed the first of the obelisks in Piazza San Pietro. The second followed in 1587 behind Santa Maria Maggiore. The gigantic obelisk of Thutmosis IV was excavated after centuries of burial in the Circus Maximus and erected in front of the Lateran Basilica in 1588. Fontana raised the 4th and final obelisk at Santa Maria del Popolo in 1589. The symbolism of Christianizing these gigantic spires is not my concern in this paper, but rather the prominence that they gave to questions about the origin and history of writing. Sixtus remained in control to a great extent of discussions about the history of writing through literary and historical works written by scholars he commissioned. In 1590, Domenico Fontana himself published Della trasportazione dell'Obelisco Vaticano e delle fabbriche di Sisto V, in which he described his memorable feat of moving the 327-ton obelisk across Rome and re-erecting it using nearly 1,000 men and 75 horses. But the two works that concern me today were written by other protégés of Sixtus. The better known of these works is Gli Obelischi di Roma, the Obelisks of Rome, by Michele Mercati, published in 1589. Angelo Rocca's Apostolic Vatican Library, transferred by Sixtus V into more splendid and commodious quarters, was published 2 years later. Mercati is better known for his Metalloteca, a substantial work of mineralogy that remained in manuscript until 1717 and thereafter became extremely well known. But Mercati's Obelischi di Roma is not a neglected work by any means. A modern edition was published in 1981. In 1994, Bruno Basile brought Mercati's work to prominence within Tasso studies by documenting Tasso's extensive reliance on it for the lore of hieroglyphics in Il Conte. Basile's edition of the dialogue is a masterful feat of philology and commentary, but I shall be approaching Il Conte from the broader perspective of what it and Mercati's Obelischi have to say about the overall history of writing as their authors understood it. This is an aspect that did not engage Basile's attention, but it is fundamental to all the questions he examined. The second work of importance to Tasso's publications of 1594 is Rocca's Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. To my knowledge, it has not been mentioned in connection with Il Conte or with any of Tasso's other works. In fact, modern publications only discuss it at all for its relevance to the architectural and artistic programs of Sixtus V. And despite its importance to what I'm calling the prehistory of the history of writing, Rocca's book has been totally neglected by modern historians of that art. The lore it contains having been exploded during the 19th century, and in some cases even earlier, it is of no interest to general historians of writing, such as Henri-Jean Martin, or to more specialized scholars, those Assyriologists and Egyptologists who continue the archaeological task of tracing the origins and earliest history of writing. To use a somewhat elastic analogy, the legendary and mythological history of writing holds even less interest for modern historians than pagan mythology did for the very most dogmatic and polemical early Christian theologians. It is considered not only wrong, but simply irrelevant, and is rarely considered even worth refuting. Not for Tasso, however, and not for the Rome of Sixtus V. Rocca's book, both scholarly and rather splendid, was important to two related sorts of historians during most of a century, for he had filled it with a good proportion of what was known about both libraries and writing itself. Scholars of ancient, medieval, and early modern literature often encounter snippets of this lore, but it rarely engages more than a paragraph's worth of attention. Ernst Robert Curtius dedicated a chapter to surveying it in European literature in the Latin Middle Ages. But as the chapter's title indicated, Curtius' interest was in the treatment of the book as a symbol. Otherwise, the mentions of all this lore, which is still brief and localized, appear most frequently in studies of early modern Neoplatonism's relation to Christianity, in what D.P. Walker christened ancient theology and Charles Schmidt called perennial philosophy. The body of works by Ficino, Giovanni Pico, Agostino Steuco, and others is central to works by Mercati, Rocca, and Tasso that I'm examining, but the latter three's attention went beyond Neoplatonism and Christianity to embrace the overall history of writing. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, would-be historians of writing expressed wonder at writing as the technology par excellence of human memory. Today, and indeed since the time of Champollion, the kind of wonder these writers were describing and expressing is extinct. Our age is more engaged with questions concerning, quote, the future of the book. That is, the rivalry between the paper codex and electronic media. But Polydor Virgil, for instance, declared that the invention of letters plainly shows how very wondrous, admirabilis, was the force of genius and memory alike in that person who first confined the seemingly infinite sounds of the voice in a few written signs of this kind. That name is forgotten, buried in antiquity, though it deserves the highest honor." End quote. Wonder and its synonyms in Latin and the vernacular languages were probably the most common terms used to discuss writing in this period. The Jesuit Hermann Hugo, who composed the first systematic attempt at a history of writing, spent his entire preface gathering expressions of wonder throughout history, from Quintilian and Pliny through Isidore of Seville and on to Hugo's own contemporary Joseph Scaliger. Hugo's 12 pages, like much of his remaining 200, are peppered with the words mirum, admiror, demiror, mirabilis, incredibilis, mysterium, and expressions like admiratione capti, divinum miraculum, incredibilis, mysterium, etc., and scribendi maestas, and still others. Hugo's De Prima Scribendi Origine was published in 1617, but treatises on what he called the admirabilitas of writing continued long after him. His book was printed again in 1738 with extensive scholarly commentary, and by the 1720s, vernacular writers, including Daniel Defoe, had taken over the task of composing erudite, laudatory histories of writing. A French quatrain first composed in 1682 was by the 1750s enshrined in the Encyclopédie, whence it was translated into English and made the rounds of vernacular histories of writing. The verses finally emerged on the sampler of a North American schoolgirl in 1828. Quote, "Whence did the wondrous, mystic art arise of painting speech and speaking to the eyes, that we by tracing magic lines are taught how both to color and to embody thought?" We might expect that as a preeminent theorist of meraviglia, living and writing in the midst of Sixtus Rome, Tasso would have similarly ecstatic praise for the art on which he staked his own reputation and immortality. It is one of the paradoxes, or perhaps simple inconsistencies is a better term, of the final decades of his life that he did not. Certainly, both Il Conte and Il Mondo Creato contain enough expressions of meraviglia, but Tasso denies such enthusiasm to his treatments of writing, despite the considerable learning that he displays about its history. Basile, who has produced the most thorough exploration of Il Conte, refers to the dialogue as a unique text in Italian literature. He notes that it, quote, interleaves Egyptian archaeology, Neoplatonic and Christian philosophy, and the history of heraldic symbols in a coherent design from which emerges a philosophy of language inspired by the example of the hieroglyphics, end quote. Tasso's dialogue draws on theories of allegory and symbolism, emblems, and imprese, with which Europeans had explored the presumed symbolism of hieroglyphs during the preceding century, and which would culminate in the extravagant publications of Athanasius Kircher in the third quarter of the next century. But expressions of wonderment are not merely missing from Tasso's discussions of writing, they are actively denied, and the art is depreciated. The same situation obtains in Il Mondo Creato. Il Conte moves through a discussion of the history of writing to a disquisition on the hieroglyphs, and finally to the history, interpretation, and ideal method of constructing imprese, which, like the other theorists since Andrea Alciato, Tasso compares to the hieroglyphs. While meraviglia appears frequently, Tasso restricts its use to praising Pope Sixtus and his nephew Cinzio Aldobrandini the dedicati, and to theorizing the proper function of an impresa. Tasso's alter ego, the forestiero napolitano, the Neapolitan stranger, who Tasso explicitly describes as modeled on Plato's own persona, opens the dialogue with a long discussion of meraviglia. The forestiero is in conversation with a gentleman friend in Rome, identified only as the Count, il Conte. The forestiero declares that he has been lost in contemplation of a marvel. Tutto intento a rimirar la nuova maraviglia dell'antico obelisco, drizzato davanti la venerabil chiesa di San Giovanni Laterano. And I guess I better translate that. All intent on gazing at the new marvel of the ancient obelisk erected in front of the venerable church of St. John in Lateran. The object of the forestiero's reverie is the obelisk of Thutmosis IV, but his meraviglia is not directed at the wonder of writing, and only in passing at Domenico Fontana's engineering. Instead, the forestiero declares that the delight of contemplating the obelisk led him on to consider the late Pope's greatness of mind as embodied in so many architectural works of unusual magnificence. The Count initially seems ready to mediate between the forestiero's courtly eulogy and the wonders of writing and engineering. He replies that the obelisks are doubly impressive, first because they had already been considered antique monuments by the ancient Romans. But the engineering behind their resurrection has been rightly celebrated, he says, as uno dei miracoli di Roma, anzi del suo pontefice, al quale non basti il fare ogni giorno opere meravigliose, ma rinnova l'antiche e con maggior meraviglia. One of the great miracles of Rome, indeed of its Pope, to whom it is not sufficient to do marvelous works every day, but instead he has to renew the ancient works with even more marvel. So right away a significant part of Tasso's program in celebrating the obelisks is revealed as courtly praise of Sixtus V. In fact, Il Conte continues an effort that Tasso had begun several years earlier in 3 lyric poems written at the time the obelisks were raised. Tasso is, as usual, fishing for a patron. The forestiero and the Conte eventually conclude that the whole purpose of an impresa, an emblem, in both its motto and its image, is to inspire meraviglia, and this leads them into a long discussion of meraviglia itself as it applies to imprese. Ancient things and modern ones, the famous monsters of Africa and the strange beasts of India, things ephemeral and things eternal, are all surveyed for their capacity to evoke wonder when appropriated in an impresa. Tasso's categorization of marvels may be a clue to the disconnect between his attitudes to writing and his notion of meraviglia. In an article from 1997, Carolyn Walker Bynum, and I'm not mentioning her just because I'm here, but Carolyn Walker Bynum drew a distinction between early modern discussions of wonder and wonder as it was conceptualized and practiced in antiquity in the Middle Ages. Wonder as discussed in Tasso's time, which was not coincidentally the heyday of the Wunderkammer, was a dramatic, arresting emotion, often characterized by surprise or stupor, and was thought to set off what Bynum refers to as the startle reflex. In its ideal form, wonder was a state of being thunderstruck, disoriented, or almost literally stunned. Conversely, before Tasso's time, wonder was a kind of meditative state. Bynum stipulates that such wonder had to be staged, and moreover it was often communicated through the reactions of what she calls an ideal reader, or what narratologists refer to as a model reader. Finally, according to Bynum, early modern wonder in its most characteristic form and functioning was Aristotelian, fitting the pattern that the philosopher described in the beginning of the Metaphysics. Wonder stimulates curiosity, curiosity leads to knowledge, and knowledge eliminates wonder. As Aristotle said, solar eclipses and even puppets are wondrous to those who do not understand them, but ideally wonder leads to a better state, which is its contrary, and which is knowledge. This is clearly the paradigm of wonder on which Tasso is drawing in Il Conte, despite his ostentatious dependence on Plato. This holds true not only in the striving for dramatic effect that the Forestiero and the Conte prescribe for a proper impresa, and not only for the overwhelming effect of seeing one of the obelisks piercing the sky vertically, but also for the Forestiero's state of mind as he describes it at the beginning of the dialogue. Quote, Io era tutto intento a rimirar la nuova maraviglia dell'antico obelisco drizzato davanti la venerabile chiesa di San Giovanni Laterano. Né per molta attenzione cessava la maraviglia, ma cresceva il desiderio di sapere molte cose appartenenti a quella altissima mole in così miracolosa maniera innalzata. Laonde l'animo, sollecito investigatore del vero, non si acquietava nel diletto del rimirare. I was all intent at gazing at the marvel of the ancient obelisk erected in front of the venerable church of St. John in Lateran, nor, despite my intense attention, did my marvel cease, but the desire to know more things about this obelisk grew all the time. Whence my soul, an enthusiastic investigator of truth, did not calm itself in the delight of looking. The Forestiero describes his state of mind as being, quote, sospeso fra il piacere della vista e la cupidità del sapere, suspended between the pleasure of seeing and the greed of knowledge. Compare this state of mind with the verses about the wonder of writing that I quoted earlier, which exhort the reader, in the near or complete absence of visual stimuli, simply to stop, consider, and meditate, to imagine a reality deprived of writing, reading, and all that these activities make possible. From at least the time of Polydore Virgil, writers on the history of writing had urged such a meditative state as the means to achieve wonder. Polydore's classification of writing as the fourth most essential reality after God, the elements, and marriage was intended to induce such a state. Clearly, at least in Il Conte, Tasso's notion of meraviglia has no room for this unspectacular variety. However, the works from 1594 show that Tasso does not simply begrudge wonderment at the art of writing, he actively opposes it. In Book 6 of Il Mondo Creato, when discussing the creation of man and woman, he refuses to legitimate marvel at human accomplishments. Instead of celebrating human genius behind the invention of writing, Tasso belittles it by exalting the instincts of brute beasts like the dog. Unlike humans, he says, who take inordinate pride in their use of logic and their ability to solve problems and transmit knowledge through writing, dogs have an innate and infallible knowledge. When faced with the question, which way did my prey go from here, a dog has no need of syllogisms or writing. His pronto senso takes the place of the lunga arte accumulated by humans. Tasso's comparison might seem worthy of Rabelais at his most facetious, who called the dog the most philosophical animal because of its patient extraction of marrow from bones. But Tasso pursues the dog's superiority in all seriousness. As Tasso develops the comparison, he repeatedly disparages the human activity of writing in terms that reflect and invert ancient, medieval, and early modern expressions of wonder at the accumulation of knowledge through writing. Humans invented and explored logic and the other branches of philosophy by writing, he says, initially scratching their syllogisms into sand or dirt. Yet, he says, we fail to understand that unless we are enlightened and inspired by God, the truths we discover are as impermanent as those ancient, rudimentary inscriptions on the ground, which were obliterated in a day by the wind or sea. Moreover, Tasso rebukes the ancients for taking pride in the supposed permanence of certain primeval inscriptions. According to the ancients, says Tasso, these inscriptions were not only the foundation of all subsequent knowledge, but a triumphant symbol of human permanence through writing. Yet such celebrations are vain and delusional, for all writing eventually dies. E benché l'antica età si gloria vanti di sacre note di colonne eccelse, in cui descritte fur le nobili arti in quel sacro a Mercurio adorno tempio, e sian per fama ancora illustri e conte l'altre colonne in cui serbar credeva da diluvi sicure e dagli incendi 1000 antiche memorie a terra sparte. In queste e quelle e nel cangiar del tempo non rimane di lor vestigio o polve, si lunga notte involve i nomi e l'opere. Let's see how fast I can translate this. And despite the fact that the ancient age glorifies and brags about the holy letters and the lofty columns in which the noblest arts were described in that decorous temple sacred to Mercury, and despite the fact that those other columns are known to fame, in which it was believed that knowledge was saved from floods and from fires, and that knowledge was historical, mille antiche memorie. Despite all this, both of these sets of columns essentially have disappeared. There's nothing left of them, not a trace or even the dust. Such a great and deep night enfolds names and works. This passage and a complementary one at the beginning of Il Conte are another key to Tasso's contrarian dialogue with praisers of writing. The eponymous count glosses the sacre note referred to in Il Mondo Creato in answer to the forestiero's question regarding the note o figure delle quali è impresso l'obelisco, the notes or figures that are impressed on the obelisk. The count affirms that these are lettere sacre e sacre sculture degli Egizi, che dai Greci furono dette ieroglifica o ierogrammata, figure di cose naturali o artificiali, con occulto e misterioso significato. Sacred letters of the Egyptians that the Greeks called hieroglyphics or hierograms, figures of natural or artificial things that had a hidden or mysterious meaning. The lofty columns, colonne ecelse of the Mondo Creato, are Tasso's term for the obelisks on which hieroglyphics were inscribed. Since Il Conte demonstrates that Tasso was familiar with the term obelisco, the vaguer reference to columns is significant. Bruno Meyer believed that the Temple of Mercury, where Tasso locates these ecelse colonne, was a historic temple erected in 495 BCE near the Circus Maximus. This would be appropriate, since the obelisk on which the Conte centers was unearthed from the Circus Maximus. But the reference to the columns as displaying texts of the noble, that is, liberal arts, indicates that Tasso was thinking of Mercury or Hermes not as the messenger god of the Greeks and Romans, but rather as Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage whose epithet, thrice great, commemorated his status as philosopher, king, and magus. According to the Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus, whose On the Sacred Mysteries of the Egyptians Tasso read in Marsilio Ficino's Latin translation, the Egyptians attributed the invention of all arts and sciences to this Hermes, whom Ficino calls Mercurius. Quote, Egyptian writers attributed their own books to Mercurius, since they believed that he had discovered all things. Mercurius was foremost in wisdom and eloquence. Pythagoras, Plato, Democritus, Eudoxus, and many others journeyed to visit the priests of the Egyptians to learn. Iamblichus went on to specify that, quote, the doctrines of my book are Assyrian and Egyptian, and come from the columns of Mercurius in Egypt. The columns of Mercurius are filled with learning. Like Bruno Meyer, one of the illustrators of Rousseau's Émile, also confused the Greek and Egyptian Hermeses. This is one of the silliest engravings I think I've ever seen in my life. But it's clearly a Greek conception of Hermes rather than an Egyptian. It's clear that the proper iconography for Tasso's reference would be more like the famous inlaid pavement of the Duomo di Siena. Tasso's verses mention not one but two sets of columns. The other set was intended to preserve mille antiche memorie, that is, centuries of history from floods and fires. As he did with Iamblichus's columns, Tasso referred very precisely to the other set. Again, the verses in Il Mondo Creato are glossed by a passage in Il Conte. Laonde le colonne dei figliuoli di Set, una delle quali fu fatta di malta contro il diluvio, l'altra di pietra perché fosse sicura dall'incendio, e quelle di mercurio in cui furono da poi scritte le scienze dei gentili, come scrive Iamblico nel principio dei suoi misteri, e gli epitafi di Semiramis o di Giacobbe, e le piramidi e gli obelischi, furono riscritti di lettere meno antiche di quelle che sono segnate nell'anima nostra, seppure è vero che ella non somigli una tavola rasa e priva di scultura. So the columns of the sons of Seth, one of which was made of, what do we call malta? Mortar, against the flood, and the other of stone to be safe from fires, and those of mercury, in which the sciences of the pagans were later written, as Iamblichus writes in the beginning of his mysteries, and the epitaphs of Semiramis and Jacob, and the pyramids and the obelisks were written with letters that are much younger than those that are impressed on our soul, if it is true that the soul doesn't resemble a clean tablet, which has no writing. Here the reference to Iamblichus is exact, but the columns that Tasso attributes to the sons of Seth, Adam's third son, which are the other set referred to in Tasso's verses, are probably still more unfamiliar to modern readers. Before explaining their significance, however, we should note in passing that here Tasso once again finds a way to deprecate and diminish the importance of human writing. He refuses to acknowledge the wondrousness of a feat which, he says, antiquity celebrated for conferring permanence on human knowledge and culture. Both sets of columns, Tasso claims, were long ago swept away, down to their last vestiges by time and the night of oblivion. Thus he does not dispute the antiquity of writing and the arts, but denies them his own meraviglia, since human time is insignificant when compared to God's eternity. As Basile correctly notes, this passage, like much of the erudition in Il Conte, corresponds closely to a moment in Michele Mercati's Gli Obelischi di Roma. The story Mercati tells was first recounted by Flavius Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities, which began with an expanded paraphrase of the book of Genesis. Josephus, who wrote in Greek in the 1st century CE, tells that Adam predicted that the world would end twice, once by a great flood and a second time by fire. Thus the sons of Adam's third son, Seth, who had discovered the rules of astronomy, wrote their discoveries on two columns, one of brick to resist fire and one of stone to safeguard their information against erasure by the flood. E l'astrologia della quale scrive Gioseffo che fosse ritrovata prima dai figliuoli di Set, figliuolo di Adamo, e che essi, volendola conservare nella memoria degli uomini, poiché furono avvertiti da Adamo che avverrerebbe una distruzione universale di tutte le cose, scrissero la loro scienza in due colonne, una delle quali era di mattoni e l'altra di pietra, affine che, guastandosi per l'acqua del diluvio la colonna di mattoni, almeno rimanesse quella di pietra, per la quale ai posteri si fosse potuto rinnovare la scienza dell'astrologia e la memoria insieme dei suoi inventori. So it's basically what I've already described, except for the fact that it's noted here that the sons of Seth also recorded their own feat of recording arts and sciences so as to memorialize themselves. Like others before and after his time, Mercati argued that Josephus' story of the Sethian columns demonstrated that letters had passed from Adam to Noah, thence to Abraham, and finally to Moses. While Basile is certainly right that Tasso cribbed this story from Mercati, it is also true that these columns of the sons of Seth are an even more common topos in early modern histories of writing than the columns of Hermes Trismegistus. In fact, the Columnae Sethianorum were mentioned as the earliest human documents more often than any other, beginning in the time of Isidore of Seville. Cassiodorus commissioned a Latin translation of Josephus' Antiquities around the year 600. And thus writers from Isidore onward made the story of the Sethians' columns an obligatory explanation of the origin of writing. 16th century Protestant polemicists, notably Melanchthon, invoked them as proof that the Bible, which alone was sufficient for salvation, had been foreshadowed during the lifetime of Adam. Tasso's Calvinist contemporary Guillaume Salus du Bartas assured the notoriety of the columns in Melanchthon's version among both Francophone and Anglophone readers when he dedicated an entire section of his Seconde Semaine, or Second Divine Week, to them. The popularity of this story through the centuries is remarkable. It occurs in practically every universal history and in most general discussions of the liberal arts or of writing, straight through the 17th and 18th centuries, when a number of university dissertations were dedicated to the columns, in Germany and elsewhere. Indeed, a book published in 2003, whose subtitle is The Permanence of Books in an Impermanent World, refers to the two columns as, quote, what could be argued was the first documented attempt to make backup files of important data as a hedge against disaster and as further insurance with two different recording media. End quote. Thus, Tasso would not have needed Mercati to give him the story of the columns, and in fact, there was no need to read a book at all, thanks to Sixtus. Tasso could have discovered the columns of the Sethians among the frescoes of the Salone Sistino in the new Vatican Library. That is, assuming he could get in. The Salone Sistino depicts 26 inventors of writing, including Hermes Trismegistus, here the sons of Seth, and then we have Hermes Trismegistus, looking Greek again. You can see Argus's head covered with eyes at his feet. Abraham, Moses, and Adam, whom I've lost. Typical. Cadmus, the legendary adapter of the Phoenician alphabet to record Greek speech, is naturally there. There are historical figures, such as Ulfila or Wulfila, the creator of the Gothic alphabet, and the semi-historical Cyril, to whom the Old Slavic alphabet was attributed. The most curious figure is Jesus Christ himself, who, as Logos, Alpha and Omega, crowns the entire series. And he gets a bigger picture than anybody else, too. The most, I already said that. It is probably no accident that all but two of the frescoes are executed on pilasters, so that they support the library, reminding us that the original columns of Hermes and the Sethians were often discussed as the first libraries. Tasso would not have had even to visit the Salone Sistino in person, however. Angelo Rocca's book described all the frescoes in considerable detail over the space of 100 pages, that is, about 4 pages per inventor on average, with obviously piles of lore. Had he needed to, Tasso could have done without both Mercati and Rocca. The question of exactly who invented the alphabet had exercised poets and scholars since antiquity. The humanist Pietro Ricci, a contemporary of Polydore Virgil, claimed in his De Honesta Disciplina of 1504 that he had found the following verses in an ancient book. Moses first wrote Hebrew letters. The wise-minded Phoenicians founded the Greek ones. The Latin ones we write were invented by Nicostrata. Abraham discovered both the Syrian and the Chaldean ones. Isis, with no less art, brought forth the Egyptian ones. Ulfila produced the ones of the Goths, which we see are the latest. In point of fact, all but the last inventor appeared in Book 1, Chapters 3 and 4 of Isidore of Seville's Etymologies. Heroic inventors were as necessary to the history of writing as authorities were to philosophy or theology. The idea that transpersonal historical evolution could create something as complex as alphabetic writing still left many writers unconvinced in the early 18th century. The lengths to which speculation was taken were aptly described by Hermann Hugo in 1617. Indeed, by that date, theories were so numerous that Hugo expressed impatience with the whole question. Philo of Alexandria maintains that Abraham first invented writing. Flavius Josephus says it was thought up by Enosh, the son of Seth, long before Abraham's time, and he finds agreement in Polydore Virgil, Peter von Ottmeyer, Pierre Grégoire, Juan Luis Vives, and Annius of Viterbo. Bibliander attributes it to Adam. We're not through yet. Eupolemus, Eusebius, Clement of Rome, Cornelius Agrippa, Crinitus, Ravisius Textor, and Lelio Gregorio Giraldi credit Moses. Clement and Cyril of Alexandria, Herodotus, Pomponius Mela, Herodian, Rufus, Festus, Zopyrian, Fornutus, Pliny the Elder, Lucan, and Joseph Scaliger assign its invention to the Phoenicians, St. Cyprian to Saturn, Tacitus to the Egyptians. Several writers mentioned by Diodorus of Sicily credit the Ethiopians. Other writers mention other inventors ad nauseam. The speculators Hugo cited range from Herodotus in the 5th century BCE to Hugo's contemporary Joseph Scaliger, who died in 1609. But the majority lived either in the first centuries of Christianity or between 1500 and 1700, that is, at times when cultural rivalries and religious turmoil were both acute. Indeed, the question of who invented writing was the primary concern of historiographers during the 1,000 years between Isidore and Hugo. Coming at the end of that millennium, Hugo expressed fear, quote, that we should continue wandering aimlessly in this Cimmerian darkness of conflicting attributions, and he deplored, quote, so many brawls among writers, so many warring opinions on the subject, calling it, quote, a conflict that will wear out every tribunal, and concluding, what will you believe? What will you not believe? End quote. However, like his predecessors, Hugo had more patience than this passage implies. He weathered the strain for 15 pages, in the course of which he examined all the sources he mentions and many more besides. The Forestiero and the Count discuss the question of the inventors at the beginning of the dialogue, Il Conte. But Tasso uses the discussion to continue detracting Meraviglia from the history of writing. After the Count has listed the canonical figures, the Phoenicians, Cadmus, Palamedes, Carmenta, and so on, he concludes that these are all very recent stories and that the most ancient evidence points to the Chaldeans or the Egyptians as the inventors of writing. At this point, the Forestiero declares his allegiance to Plato's Phaedrus, the most famous detraction of the importance of writing ever, which tells the story of Hermes, or Theut, inventing writing for the purpose of recording advances in culture. As everyone knows, the king of Egypt, to whom the god extols writing, rejects it as a mere reminder rather than memory, and in reality, the destroyer of memory. Worse, the Forestiero displays his Counter-Reformation credentials by literally demonizing the god. Quote, diremo adunque che ne fosse l'inventore Theut, demone degli Egizi, come credeva Socrate nel Phaedro. So we'll say that the inventor was Theut, the daimon of the Egyptians. To this, the Count replies that a humoristic interpretation is preferable, one that credits humans, that is. Si buona invenzione come quella delle lettere non sarebbe mai da me attribuita a si maligna causa come il demonio, laonde io direi che Theut fosse un uomo, o sacerdote o re degli Egizi, come è creduto per molti uomini di molta dottrina, i quali estimorno che fosse Mercurio Trismegisto. Such a great invention as the letters would never be attributed by me to such an evil cause as the devil. So I would say that Teot must have been a man, either a priest or a king of the Egyptians, as many learned men have believed, who have believed also that it was actually Hermes Trismegistus. Other names are possible, the count continues. Some are Egyptians, but Jews and Christians often nominate Moses, Job, or Abraham. Oppure ne recano l'origine ad Adamo stesso, dinanzi al diluvio, perché Adamo impose il nome a tutte le cose, e a me pare che appartenga agli stesso il nominare le cose o lo scriverle. So the count says sometimes they take it all the way back to Adam before the flood, because Adam gave names to all the things. But it seems to me that naming things and writing them down is the same thing. The Forestiero, however, will have none of these half-hearted compromises. Quote, se non vi piace onorare I demoni di questa invenzione, onoriamone gli angeli piuttosto, e diciamo che un angelo insegnasse ad Adamo di nominare le cose, e un angelo da poi portasse la legge scritta a Mosè, come fu l'opinione dell'Areopagita. So if you don't want to honor the demons or daimons with this invention, let's honor the angels instead, and let's say that an angel taught Adam how to name the things, how to name everything, and an angel afterwards took the written law down to Moses, as was the opinion of Dionysius the Areopagite. By invoking Dionysius the Areopagite, the Forestiero calls in the acknowledged expert on angelology and reinforces his own Counter-Reformation credentials by implicitly defending the historicity of Pseudo-Dionysius. But the main point for Tasso's mouthpiece is that writing is too precious to be ascribed to human inventors, and the Count understands him perfectly. The Count says, quote, divina dunque, non umana, fu l'invenzione delle lettere. So the invention of letters was not a human thing, it was a divine thing. The Forestiero emphatically ratifies this opinion. Divina senza fallo è ritrovata da Dio e per mezzo degli angeli mandata agli uomini, come opinione del medesimo Areopagita. Quote, so yes, indeed, it was a divine invention found by God and brought down to men by the angels, as Dionysius tells us. Thus concludes the Forestiero, the primeval colonne mentioned in Josephus' story about the sons of Seth, and in Iamblichus's tale of Hermes Trismegistus, and in all the other supposed earliest inscriptions on pyramids and obelisks, are mere latecomers. All human texts are written in letters less ancient than the ones God inscribed on our soul, unless it be true that the soul is a tabula rasa. And not even the soul is the oldest tablet. Quote, e avanti queste lettere che portiamo nell'anima, scrisse Dio nel libro della predestinazione, veduto in visione da San Giovanni, i nomi che sono certi dell'eternità e sicuri dalla morte e dall'oblivione. So even before these letters that we carry printed on our soul, God wrote in the book of predestination, which St. John saw in a vision, the names of those who are certain of eternal blessedness and safe from death and oblivion. Surely, the Forestiero adds, the name of the late Pope Sixtus is among those deathless names, along with the Emperor Constantine's. Il Conte has some of the more maddening characteristics of Tasso's erudition as displayed in his late dialogues. First, it displays an uneasy attitude to humanism. To praise human inventors is to neglect to honor God with the invention of writing. And Tasso's quite fearful in his extreme end of his life about his salvation. Courtly and interested, even obsequious, the dialogue seems to pull the rug out from under the erudition whenever it attempts to employ that learning to gain favor from Tasso's addressees. Rarely is this sort of compliment turned out with sprezzatura. However, both Il Conte and the passages on writing in Il Mondo Creato remind us of how hard Tasso worked even at the end of his life, to remain à la page, both as a society man and as a committed scholar. For all their awkwardness, the two works demonstrate something more authentic about Tasso the writer. His desire to be a good Counter-Reformation subject conflicts sharply at times with his dedication to humanism and learning. As the conversation is beginning in Il Conte, the forestiero is already nervous about the role that curiosity has played in his desire to know more about the obelisks. On the one hand, Sixtus obelisks, particularly the one at San Giovanni in Laterano, have brought back the names of the emperors Constantine and Constantius from oblivion and given modern writers a worthy Christian task. That's a good thing. Quote, il Santissimo Pontefice ha cavato quasi dalle tenebre e dalle ruine il nome sepolto di quegli invitissimi principi e data agli scrittori di questa età nobilissima occasione di celebrarlo. So the Holy Father has taken the names of these unconquered princes and given them to modern writers to have something noble to celebrate. However, the fact remains that the obelisks themselves are pagan artifacts. While the deeds of Constantine and his son are well known already, quote, senza fatica ancora di nuove scritture, in other words, we don't need new writers to tell us about Constantine, the deeds of the pharaohs celebrated by the obelisks are still largely unknown. This fact sets Christian alarm bells ringing, warning that the desire to know more about the pagans may be the kind of vain curiosity condemned ever since the Church Fathers. Quote, forse curiosità il voler saper troppo, perché alla falsa pietà dei gentili, dei barbari, la cui impietà è eterno castigo, per avventura non si conviene il premio di più lunga o di più durevol fama. End quote. So maybe it's vain curiosity to know or to want to know too much, because perhaps it isn't fitting to give the prize of long or durable fame to the false piety of the barbarians, because their impiety has merited eternal chastisement. This kind of doubt crippled the Gerusalemme Liberata between 1575 and 1581, and in 1593 it made the Conquistata, the rewrite of the Liberata, a stillborn epic, one edition, until recent times. But unlike the empirical Tasso, the forestiero has a ready remedy for his doubt, only slightly tainted with bad faith. Quote, tutta volta noi non ricerchiamo di soddisfare alla virtù dei barbari, ma al nostro desiderio di sapere le cose dei nemici, e quelle in particolare che sono lontanissime di luogo e remotissime di tempo. End quote. But anyway, on the other hand, we're not trying to do justice to the virtues of the barbarians, but rather to our desire to know the things of our enemies, and those in particular that are from long ago and far away. Surely, as Tasso remarked in the Discorsi, matters that happened too long ago or far away are not truly relevant to modern audiences and so are harmless. But this observation, which Tasso does not make explicitly here, brings the forestiero right back to vain curiosity. Quote, però io vorrei sapere quali note o quali figure sono queste delle quali è impresso l'obelisco e qual sia la significanza di ciascuna. End quote. But I really would like to know what these notes or figures are that are impressed on this obelisk, and I'd like to know the significance of every one of them. The flaw in the logic, we need to know about our enemies, but these enemies lived long ago and far away, reveals nervousness and bad faith, just as creating imprese meravigliose or praising human inventors smacks of vainglory. But these inconsistencies make Tasso's humanistic interest in and repressed wonder at the history of writing all the more precious as a symptom of his restless desire for erudition. Thank you.
At what point did the historians or linguists start comparing the form of the Greek letters and the Hebrew letters, and
I'm going to have to wait and ask you to rephrase that. I didn't catch it.
oh, okay. At what point did the scholars start comparing the formation of the Greek letters, the Hebrew letters, and start wondering about the similarities and the coincidences?
Pretty early. Late antiquity, early Middle Ages. Isidore says that the Greek letters are descended from the Hebrew, and the Latin are descended from the Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a vague notion already, which is not so much a philological notion as it is political correctness in a way, because Hebrew has to be the oldest language, and Moses has to be the oldest author. Although Isidore does, when he's talking about the oldest authors, he does say Moses is the oldest author among us, whereas among the pagans, Darius the Phrygian is the oldest. Darius the Phrygian being a late antique forgery that was supposed to refute Homer's version of the Trojan War. So, but anyway, this, they're vague notions of this pretty early.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
These barbarians are relatively nearby. They were aware of the Chinese language, different kinds of letters have different.
Not really until the Jesuits got into China. Okay, they didn't have any real knowledge
Did
until.
someone like Marco Polo bring back more than spaghetti?
He didn't bring back any Chinese works of literature that I know of. Do you remember anything, John? I don't remember anything in Marco Polo that would lead me to believe that. He must have had some knowledge, but again, he's dictating in prison to a guy who's actually a writer of romances. So I doubt Rustichello da Pisa was all that. He'd been all that interested in.
You could have thought the Chinese wrote Italian letters.
Maybe so. And they like pasta alla vongole.
What about the current translations of the Egyptian symbols? That the current researcher scholarship on that. How does that jive with where these guys were going?
These guys were, and there's a really good explanation of what they thought in Mercati's book, the one on the obelisk. Mercati says there were two kinds of writing at the beginning of time. One was the alphabetic, which the Hebrews invented, and the other was the sacred writing of the Egyptian priests, which is symbolic, and into which one has to be initiated. So the hieroglyphics were thought of as being sort of holy rebuses, or symbols in that sense. In other words, an eye was the vigilant eye of God, or this sort of thing. And this all starts becoming of true interest in the early 16th century. And with the vogue of these imprese, or emblems, suddenly everybody's interested in the hieroglyphs, because it has seemed evident since antiquity that the hieroglyphs were symbols, not letters or signs. Okay. And by the time you get down to Vico has all sorts of wonderful ideas about what happened at the beginning of time with writing. All sorts of forgettings and rememberings and reappropriations and so on. Yeah.
So did they pass down knowledge before that through oral history?
Who?
Spoken?
Who?
Oral history.
I know, but who are we talking about? Are we talking about the actual writers?
Writing, before writing to pass down knowledge. If it wasn't in writing, was it the oral by the spoken language?
Yes and no. Still in the late 18th century, one of my English writers of a history of writing, says that without writing there can be no true history. Okay, so oral stuff was probably there, but it was worthless. Okay, and remember, Homer is still thought of as an author, right? It's Milman Parry in the 1930s who comes up with the best explanation of how Homer could have been an oral poet, right? The oral formulaic thesis, right? That you have these epithets which are metrically different and can be interchanged so that you can just improvise a perfect hexameter from memory, not because you've memorized it word by word, but because you've got an innate feel for the meter. And if you say Achilles and you've already got too many syllables in there, you can't say swift-footed. You got to say something else. Okay, but you just do that right away. But the notion that there was any good knowledge orally was not there, with one exception, and that exception was Kabbalah. Okay, the Kabbalah comes to attention in the 15th century, not that it hasn't been in anybody else's attention among the Jews, but it really comes to the attention of Christians in the 15th century. Okay, Christians have known about the Talmud, but the Talmud's written down. But they've known that they start finding out in the Quattrocento that the Kabbalah was originally oral teachings. Okay, but they have a story about how the Kabbalah eventually had to be written down because Esdras, who rewrote the Bible after the Babylonian captivity, was afraid that if they kept relying on oral transmission, that it would be lost. Okay, so back to our guy in the 18th century, he's writing in 1786, I think, and then he's got a second edition in 1803, and he says, without writing, there's no history. And really, the word prehistory, right? Prehistory, I think, dates to 1851, the term. Okay. The idea that there's a history before history that we can read by looking at things rather than writing dates to about 1851. That is, the coinage of the word prehistory dates to that time. So, oral, what is it? Verba volant, scripta manent, right? Word or spoken words fly away, written words stick around.
So I have a question about the word science. I noticed science in there several times. And where was that originally used, and where would you date that to? Roughly?
It's not our science.
Oh, it's not our science.
It's not our science. It just means knowledge. It just means knowledge.
Okay.
Okay.
And when was that first used as knowledge in context? When was that?
Oh wow, that's Latin.
Latin.
I mean,
it's
classical Latin,
okay.
right? Scientia.
Okay.
Right? So, yeah, but science, as in physical science or even social science.
Modern.
Not there.
Okay.
Shane says lo scibile, what can be known. Okay. Things that can be known. Yeah.
In these debates, do you find any of the kinds of issues you find in somebody like Baudin about whether words have force and behave, whether they mean things or not, or is that just absent from this discourse?
Cradalism and
Yeah.
things of that sort. There's not much of that in these debates. Okay, clearly the whole notion of magical language is out there. You've got everything from grimoires and other books of magic to theories of magic that are used not only by necromancers themselves, but by, let's call them inquisitors against, let's call them witches. But these guys are more interested in the transmission of real knowledge. Okay? They're not so much interested in magical words, unless they get interested in Kabbalah, in which case they can talk about magic without sinning too much. Yeah?
Does that expressed fear that writing would replace or replace memory suggests that it was believed that the individual could master all knowledge?
It expresses Socrates' faith in dialogue and dialectic, speaking to each other, as the way to gain real knowledge. It's not so much about the preservation of knowledge, although Socrates does assume that once you get knowledge, you're not going to let go of it very easily. Okay, but basically, Socrates in that dialogue, who knows what the real Socrates thought, just says, writing's a laundry list, right? It's just to remind you of stuff that you would otherwise forget. But it's not about the important things. Philosophy is only doable through dialogue. Okay. Which is interesting because that's the passage of Plato that everybody always talks about. You notice Tasso talks about it. Everybody talks about it. Derrida talked about it. But there's a contrary passage in Plato, which is all about the inestimable value of writing, and that's in the beginning of the Timaeus, right? When Solon when Solon goes to visit the Egyptian priests and learns that the Greeks are babies, because every time they've gained a little bit of knowledge, they get whacked by a flood or a fire and have to start all over again. But the Egyptians, because of the Nile, are protected from both fire and water, and therefore their records go back thousands and thousands of years. Right? In fact, Solon learns about Athens 9,000 years before his own time. Right? How Athens saved the world from the aggressive culture of Atlantis. Okay. But it's two contrary myths in Plato. But it's interesting to me that the only one that seems to get talked about among some writers, even before our own time, but certainly in our own time, is the negative assessment of writing, the one that's truly positive, hardly ever gets mentioned. Someday, if I have about 4 or 5 months to waste, maybe I'll try to read all this crappy stuff about Atlantis and see if any of them talk about it. I'm too old to have enough time to do that. Was there somebody down? Yeah.
And this may be off topic, but is there anything come up about, this is all about writing, but has anything come up about literacy and reading in any of these discussions? Because it's a question of who's going to read the writing that has an effect on history.
Writing is, what's the best way to answer this? Dante still refers to Latin as grammatica, because if you're going to write, you've got to learn the language that is to be written. Okay? Dante himself obviously doesn't believe that that's the only way to write, but the Latin tradition is that you learn a language in order to write it. Okay? And there's really sort of no question about literacy, because if you don't do the apprenticeship, you know, in the church essentially, or the law or medicine, you don't count anyway. I mean, this begins to change, obviously, really in Dante's time or a little before, when you get merchants reading and writing in their native language. But for most of these guys, it's not really a problem. I haven't really sat down and tried to find the first discussion of this in detail in a modern language, but it might be Mercati, Tasso's guy, the guy Tasso's cribbing from. Everything else I can remember from before that time is in Latin.
I think